SUA. Sir, you need to step outside. The police are here because you refused to follow the HOA. That was the first thing I heard at 8:14 on a Tuesday morning, standing barefoot on my front porch with a cup of coffee in my hand. Victoria Bennett, the president of our neighborhood HOA, stood beside the patrol car with the kind of confident smile people wear when they believe the outcome is already decided. She held a folder against her chest and pointed toward me. Mr. Parker has repeatedly refused HOA directives, ignored violation notices, and stated that our rules don't apply to him. The officer looked at me. Is that accurate? I took a slow sip of coffee. I told her I'm not in your HOA. Victoria laughed. There. You heard him. But I wasn't finished. And I asked her to show me the document that says I am. Her smile tightened. The officer asked for my identification, then asked which property I owned. I gave him the deed. He glanced at it, then at Victoria. Ma'am, this appears to show Mr. Parker as the owner. Victoria waved her hand. That's one house. We're talking about HOA compliance. One house. That was the assumption she had been making for months. She thought I was just another homeowner who had decided to be difficult. She had no idea how carefully I had kept my records. My name is Ethan Parker. I'm 58 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life buying and managing residential properties. I don't make a habit of explaining my finances to neighbors, and I certainly don't announce every property I purchase. In this neighborhood, that privacy worked in my favor. Victoria had started with small violation notices. A parking complaint. A landscaping complaint. A demand that I attend an HOA meeting. None of it seemed important enough to fight over, so I documented everything and stayed quiet. But then she crossed the line. She began insisting that I owed the association fees and penalties connected to properties I owned but that were occupied by tenants. When I asked her to provide the governing documents, she told me the HOA had already determined its authority. That was when I stopped treating the notices as annoying paperwork and started treating them as evidence. Now she had called the police, expecting them to make me comply. Instead, the officer was reading my deed. He looked up again. Ms. Bennett, do you know exactly which property we're discussing? She pointed toward my house. That one. The officer checked his tablet. His expression changed slightly. Interesting. Victoria frowned. What? He turned the screen toward her. This property is registered to Ethan Parker. She folded her arms. Yes, obviously. The officer paused. I think you should check the county records before we go any further. Victoria's confidence finally slipped. She still believed this was about one house. She didn't know that I had already pulled the records for every property in the neighborhood. And she definitely didn't know that her emergency HOA meeting, scheduled for 72 hours later, was about to become the most important meeting of her career. The officer handed the deed back to me, but Victoria still refused to accept what was right in front of her. She stepped closer to the patrol car and lowered her voice. There has to be a mistake. The association has records. The officer nodded. Then you should bring those records to the county office. Victoria looked at me as if I had somehow caused the problem. I said nothing. She finally turned toward her car, but before she left, she pointed at me and said, This is not over, Mr. Parker. She was right about that. It was only beginning. Once the police left, I went inside and opened the filing cabinet in my study. I pulled out the folder I had started 3 months earlier, when Victoria first began sending me notices. Every letter was there, arranged by date. Every envelope had been saved. Every fee had been recorded. I had learned a long time ago that memory was useful, but paperwork was better. The first notice had been for a landscaping violation. The second claimed I had failed to follow a parking rule. The third demanded an administrative fee connected to a property that was not even my primary residence. At the time, none of those notices seemed important enough to justify a fight. But when the notices started appearing faster, I began looking for a pattern. There was one. Victoria was not simply trying to make me follow neighborhood rules. She was trying to establish that the HOA had authority over properties that I owned but that were occupied by people who had never agreed to join the association. That distinction mattered. So I called Daniel Brooks, the attorney who had handled several of my property transactions over the years. Daniel was the kind of attorney who rarely reacted before seeing the documents. I sent him scans of every notice, every payment demand, and the deed from my house. He called me back that afternoon. "Ethan, I have a question. How many properties do you own in that development?" I looked through the records on my desk. "A few." He paused. "That is not an answer." I smiled. "Why do you ask?" He told me that the language in the HOA notices appeared to assume that the association had authority over every property connected to certain addresses. If I own multiple homes, the issue could be much larger than one dispute. I asked him to check the county records. He agreed. The next morning, Daniel called again. His voice was different this time. "I checked 5 properties." I waited. "All 5 are connected to you." That was information Victoria did not have. But I still did not tell Daniel how many properties were actually in my portfolio. I wanted the records to speak for themselves. Then he said something that changed the entire situation. "Ethan, there is an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for 72 hours from now. They are planning to vote on a resolution concerning your compliance." I opened the calendar on my desk and looked at the date. The meeting was not just about my house anymore. It was about whether the HOA could use its authority against every property connected to me. I told Daniel to keep checking. He asked how many addresses he should review. I gave him one instruction. Start with the oldest purchase and work forward. 3 hours later, my phone rang again. Daniel did not say hello. He said, "Ethan, you need to come see what I found." Daniel had found something that made the 72-hour countdown suddenly feel much shorter. I drove to his office that afternoon, carrying the same folder I had been building for months. He was standing beside a conference table covered with printed county records, property tax statements, and maps of the neighborhood. "You asked me to start with the oldest purchase," he said. I did. He slid the first record toward me. The address belonged to a small 2-bedroom house near the eastern entrance. I recognized it immediately. I had bought it 11 years earlier from an owner who wanted to move closer to her daughter. Daniel placed another record beside it. Then another. Then another. 5 properties, he said. All connected to you. I nodded. Keep going. He looked at me carefully. How many are we talking about? I told him I wanted the records before I gave him an answer. That was important. I did not want assumptions. I wanted documents. Daniel continued working through the county database while I reviewed the HOA notices. The more records we checked, the stranger the pattern became. The association had treated several of my properties as though their individual occupants were members of the HOA, even though the ownership records told a different story. But there was something else. The HOA had been collecting fees associated with those properties. Some were ordinary assessments. Others were labeled administrative charges, compliance fees, and special penalties. Daniel circled one entry with a blue pen. This one concerns me. I leaned closer. The charge had been applied to a property I owned, but the notice had been sent to a tenant who had no authority to alter the ownership status. Why does that matter? I asked. Daniel pointed to the governing documents. Because if the association is claiming authority based on ownership, they need to establish exactly who is bound by those rules. He turned another page. And if they are treating your properties as part of their voting structure, that creates another problem. That was the first moment I realized Victoria's confidence might have been based on an assumption she had never bothered to verify. I asked Daniel to keep checking. By late afternoon, he had confirmed 18 properties connected to me. 18. I had expected him to find several. I had not expected the number to climb that quickly. He leaned back in his chair. Ethan, why did you buy so many homes here? I looked at the map on the table. Because they were good properties in a growing area, and I wanted long-term rental income. That was true, But it was not the whole story. Years earlier, I had noticed that families were being priced out whenever older homes were sold to investors. I decided that if I could keep some of those homes available as stable rentals, I would. I never needed recognition for it. I simply bought properties when the right opportunities appeared. Daniel tapped the map. There is another issue. He pointed to the boundaries of the HOA. Your properties are scattered throughout the entire development. They are not concentrated in one corner. I studied the map. 18 small markers were spread across the neighborhood. Then Daniel opened another county record. There is an emergency meeting in 72 hours. Victoria is proposing a resolution that would require every affected property owner to acknowledge the HOA's authority. I looked at him. Every affected owner? Daniel nodded. That is the language. He paused, then opened the next file. But there is one thing we have not checked yet. He turned the screen toward me. The remaining addresses. I counted the markers on the map. There were far more than 18. Daniel picked up the phone and began requesting another batch of county records. I watched him work for several minutes before he finally stopped. His eyes stayed on the screen. Ethan, he said quietly, I think we need to talk about why you bought these homes in the first place. The question hung in the room because I knew there was more behind those 18 properties than Daniel had yet discovered. I looked at the map again and followed the small blue markers with my finger. I bought them when they became available, I said. That is all. Daniel shook his head. Maybe. But the pattern is unusual. He pulled up the purchase records one by one. The first property had been purchased 11 years ago. The next came 2 years later. Then 3 more within a single year. After that, the purchases became more frequent. 7 properties changed hands over the following 18 months. You were building a portfolio, Daniel said. Yes. But why this neighborhood? I looked at him for a moment before answering. Because I knew the area would grow. That was the simple answer. The deeper answer was that I had seen what happened when development moved too quickly. Older homes disappeared, rents increased, and families who had lived in the area for years were forced to move farther away. I wanted to own enough homes to keep some of them stable. I had never told Victoria that. I had never needed to. Daniel returned to the records. There is another detail. He enlarged the neighborhood map. Look at where your properties are located. The 18 markers were not random. They formed a loose circle around the center of the development. I had never noticed it because I had bought the homes years apart. Daniel zoomed in again. Several of these properties border the private roads and shared access points. I nodded. That still does not give me control over the HOA. Correct, he said. But it may give you something else. He opened the original purchase documents for several properties. Some contained separate references to easements, access rights, and maintenance responsibilities. Nothing looked dramatic by itself. Together, however, they created a picture Victoria clearly had not considered. Then Daniel opened the HOA governing documents. Here's what I want you to see. He highlighted a section concerning ownership records and voting rights. The association has been operating under the assumption that the owners listed on their internal database are accurate. I frowned. And they are not? Daniel shook his head. Not completely. That changed the way I looked at the entire dispute. Victoria had been acting as though the HOA's internal records were the final word. They were not. County records were different. Property tax records were different. Deeds were different. And now we had 18 properties where the official records pointed back to me. Daniel leaned forward. There is still something missing. We have 18 confirmed properties, but your purchase history suggests there may be more. I asked him to continue. He pulled another batch of records and started matching addresses against the county database. One by one, more names disappeared from the screen and were replaced by mine. 23. 27. 31. Then 36. I stopped counting. Daniel finally turned the monitor toward me. Ethan, we have crossed 36. I stared at the list. How many are left? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened a spreadsheet containing every residential address inside the HOA boundary. There were 60 homes in total. I looked at the 60 rows and then at Daniel. "Check everyone," I said. He nodded. "I already started." A few minutes later, another record appeared. Then another. Then another. Daniel's expression became more serious with every entry. Finally, he closed the laptop halfway and looked directly at me. "Ethan, before we go any further, you need to understand something. If these records are what I think they are, Victoria is not dealing with one homeowner." He opened the laptop again. "She is dealing with the owner of the entire neighborhood." 60, Daniel said. "Every residential address inside the association boundary." I stared at the spreadsheet, then at the stack of county records covering his desk. 60 homes. 60 separate purchase records. 60 properties that Victoria Bennett believed were controlled by her association. I had known I owned a lot of homes. I had not stopped to count them as one group because I had acquired them over 11 years, one opportunity at a time. Daniel began matching the remaining addresses against the county database. 41. 47. 52. Then 60. Every single address connected back to my ownership records. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The surprise was not that I owned the homes. The surprise was that Victoria had never checked. She had been sending notices, demanding fees, and calling the police while relying almost entirely on an internal HOA database that did not reflect the county records. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "This changes everything." I nodded, but I was not interested in celebrating. There was still a larger question. Why had Victoria become so determined to establish authority over my properties? Daniel started comparing the HOA financial statements with the property records. That was when we found something neither of us expected. The association had been collecting assessments connected to all 60 addresses, but the financial reports did not clearly distinguish between owner assessments and several additional administrative charges. Some of those charges had appeared repeatedly on properties I owned. I asked Daniel to highlight every payment connected to my addresses. The list filled 3 pages. "How much?" I asked. He calculated the total. "Enough to make this worth investigating." I looked at the clock. We had less than 2 days before the emergency meeting. Victoria had already decided that the meeting would be about forcing me to recognize the HOA's authority. Now I understood that it could become something very different. Daniel told me not to confront her. He wanted certified copies of the deeds, complete financial records, every notice I had received, and the HOA governing documents. I agreed. That evening, I returned home and opened the same filing cabinet where I had stored every notice Victoria had sent me. I placed the documents beside the county records. For months, I had treated each violation as an isolated annoyance. Now they looked like pieces of one larger pattern. The next morning, Victoria sent another notice. It gave me 24 hours to acknowledge the association's authority or face additional penalties. I read it twice. Then I noticed the date of the original complaint. It had been filed shortly after the HOA learned that several rental properties in the neighborhood had changed ownership. That timing bothered me. I called Daniel immediately. He checked the meeting minutes. 10 minutes later he called back. "Ethan, you need to see this." He read me a sentence from an old HOA meeting record. The board had discussed a plan to consolidate ownership information and increase enforcement against properties they described as non-compliant investor holdings. I asked who had proposed it. Daniel paused. Victoria Bennett. That was the first time the pieces connected. She had not simply decided that I was difficult. She had been trying to establish control over my properties before she understood who actually owned them. And now she had scheduled a meeting where she planned to make that authority official. I closed the folder and looked at the calendar. 48 hours remained. Daniel had one final question. "Do you want me to tell her how many homes you own?" I shook my head. "No. Let her walk into that meeting believing she is still in control." "Ethan, they just called the police again." Daniel's voice was unusually serious when he called me the next morning. I had been expecting another HOA notice, not another police visit. What happened? I asked. Victoria claims you are interfering with the association's operations. I looked at the stack of documents on my desk. I have not contacted her. I know, Daniel said. But she is becoming increasingly concerned about the meeting. That made sense. She still did not know what we had found. I told Daniel to send me every document he had verified and then drove to the county records office myself. I wanted certified copies, not screenshots or summaries. If Victoria intended to turn this into a formal dispute, I wanted every fact supported by an official record. By the time I arrived, 2 police officers were already waiting outside the records office. One of them recognized me from the previous morning. Mr. Parker, we just want to clarify something, he said. We received another complaint from the HOA. I nodded. Then let us clarify it. I showed them the certified deed for my property, and explained that my attorney was reviewing the association's claims. I did not accuse Victoria of anything. I did not raise my voice. I simply asked the officers to verify the records themselves. One officer opened the county database. The other looked through the documents I had brought. After several minutes, the first officer frowned. There is something strange here. He pulled up the HOA's address list. Then he compared it with the county records. These ownership names do not match. I looked at him. How many are different? He started checking. 5, 10, 15. His expression changed as the number increased. There are quite a few. I did not tell him the number we had already confirmed. I wanted the official records to establish it independently. Then Victoria arrived. She walked through the front doors carrying a folder and immediately saw me standing with the officers. There he is, she said. He is refusing to cooperate again. The officer turned toward her. Ms. Bennett, we are reviewing the ownership records. Victoria's confidence returned. The HOA records clearly establish who belongs to the association. The officer answered calmly. We are not reviewing the HOA records. We are reviewing county property records. That sentence changed her expression. She opened her folder and started searching for documents. I have everything right here. She handed over several pages. The officer compared them with the county records. These appear to be association records, not deeds. Victoria insisted that the HOA had authority over the properties. I finally spoke. Then the meeting in 2 days should give everyone a chance to review the actual ownership records. She looked at me sharply. Why are you so confident? I gave her the same answer I had given the officers. Because I have the documents. She left without another word. That afternoon, Daniel called me with an update. He had completed the final verification. Every one of the 60 residential addresses inside the HOA boundary was connected to my ownership records. 60 out of 60. But there was still one problem. Daniel had discovered that Victoria had prepared a resolution that could affect not only my properties, but the association's entire voting process. If she presented it at the emergency meeting, the 60 homes could become the central issue in front of every resident. Daniel told me we needed to decide exactly what to reveal and when. I looked at the 60 certified records spread across my desk. We reveal nothing early, I said. Let her explain her version first. Daniel understood immediately. And then? I closed the final folder. Then we let the records speak. By the time the meeting began, Victoria Bennett still believed she was about to force me into compliance. She walked into the community clubhouse carrying a thick binder, followed by 2 HOA board members and several residents who had clearly been told only one side of the story. I arrived 10 minutes later with Daniel Brooks and 60 folders. I did not say anything about what was inside them. The room was already tense. Victoria stepped to the front table and welcomed everyone to what she called an emergency compliance meeting. Then she looked directly at me. Mr. Parker has repeatedly refused to acknowledge the authority of this association, she said. Tonight, we are going to resolve that problem. I sat quietly beside Daniel. He placed the first folder in front of me. The meeting agenda called for a vote on a resolution requiring certain property owners to formally acknowledge HOA jurisdiction and comply with outstanding assessments. Victoria described the resolution as routine. I knew it was not. The first resident asked why the resolution was necessary. Victoria explained that several properties had become non-compliant investor holdings, and that stronger enforcement was needed to protect neighborhood standards. I watched the room carefully. Some residents nodded. Others looked confused. Then Victoria called my name. Mr. Parker, perhaps you would like to explain why you refused to cooperate. I stood. I would be happy to. Daniel gave me a small nod. I looked around the room. Before anyone votes, I think we should establish who actually owns the properties being discussed. Victoria immediately interrupted. Ownership is not the issue. Daniel opened the first folder. It becomes the issue when the association's records contradict the county records. The room went quiet. Victoria frowned. What are you talking about? Daniel placed a certified deed on the table. He read the address aloud. One of the residents recognized it. That is my rental house, the man said. Daniel looked at him. You rent that property, correct? The man nodded. Then you are not the owner. Daniel turned the deed toward the room. The county record lists Ethan Parker as the owner. A murmur moved through the room. Victoria stepped forward and said the document must be outdated. Daniel opened another folder. Here is the current tax record. Then another. Here is the recorded deed. Then another. Here is the county ownership confirmation. Victoria's face tightened. How many properties are you claiming to own? She asked me. I looked at the 60 folders lined across the table. That depends on whether you want the association's records or the county's records. She stared at me. What does that mean? I answered calmly. It means your database is incomplete. Daniel opened the next folder. And before we continue this vote, the residents deserve to know exactly how incomplete it is. He placed 5 folders in a row. Then 5 more. The room became quieter with every address. 10 properties. 15. 20. Victoria stopped speaking. One resident stood up and walked closer to the table. Wait. Are you saying he owns these houses? Daniel nodded. According to the county records, yes. Victoria finally raised her voice. This is ridiculous. He cannot possibly own all of them. I looked at her. You should have checked before calling the police. Nobody moved. Daniel reached for another folder. We are not finished. He placed the next record on the table. Then another. Then another. The number kept climbing towards 60. Victoria's carefully prepared meeting was no longer about forcing me to recognize her authority. It was becoming a public examination of who actually held the property rights behind the neighborhood she claimed to control. Then Daniel placed one final document in front of Victoria. Before we open the remaining records, there is something else you need to see. Her eyes dropped to the page. For the first time since I had met her, Victoria Bennett looked completely uncertain. The document Daniel placed in front of Victoria was not another deed. It was the HOA ownership and voting register from the day the association was created. Victoria looked at it for several seconds before asking, What am I supposed to be seeing? Daniel pointed to a section near the bottom. The association has been calculating voting rights and assessments using an internal ownership list that does not match the county records. A resident near the back of the room raised his hand. What does that mean for us? Daniel answered carefully. It means the association may have been relying on inaccurate ownership information when making certain decisions. Victoria shook her head. That is an administrative issue. It has nothing to do with Mr. Parker's refusal to follow the rules. I finally stood again. It has everything to do with it if the rules were being enforced against properties that the association never verified. Victoria looked at me. You are trying to confuse everyone. I pointed toward the 60 folders. I am not asking anyone to trust me. I am asking everyone to read the records. Daniel opened another folder. This is the current deed for property number 26. Then he opened another. This is property number 27. Another. Number 28. The pattern was undeniable. The same ownership name appeared again and again. Ethan Parker. A resident slowly sat back in his chair. How many are there? Daniel answered. 60. The room went completely quiet. Victoria looked at the folders as if they had suddenly become something she could not explain. That cannot be correct. Daniel placed the final ownership summary on the table. We verified every address through the county records. One of the board members leaned toward Victoria and whispered something. She did not answer. I could see the confidence she had carried into the meeting disappearing one piece at a time. But I still had not explained why I owned so many homes. Daniel knew the answer, but he waited for me to speak. I bought them over 11 years, I said. Whenever a homeowner wanted to sell and the property made sense, I purchased it. I kept the homes as long-term rentals. A woman sitting near the front raised her hand. Then why did the HOA send me notices about my house? I looked at her. Because they believed you were the owner. She looked toward Victoria. But I rent from you? Yes. Her expression changed from confusion to disbelief. Then another resident spoke. I rent from him too. A third person nodded. The room began to understand what had happened. Victoria had been treating tenants as if they were the owners while applying association demands to properties that were legally connected to someone else. Daniel opened the financial records. There is another issue. He showed the board a series of administrative charges attached to several of my properties. These fees were collected even though the ownership information was not properly verified. Victoria immediately objected. Those charges were authorized. Daniel nodded. Then the association should be able to explain exactly how they were calculated. No one answered. He turned to the board president's folder and placed one final page in front of Victoria. It showed the original proposal for the enforcement campaign. Her name appeared beside the motion. The room went silent again. Victoria looked at me. You knew all of this before tonight. I answered. I knew enough to ask questions. The records answered the rest. Daniel closed the folder. There is still one matter we have not addressed. Victoria stared at him. What matter? He pointed to the emergency resolution on the table. The resolution you plan to vote on tonight would have required property owners to acknowledge authority that the association never properly established. Victoria looked around the room. For the first time, the meeting was no longer moving according to her plan. Then one resident stood and asked the question nobody had asked at the beginning. If Ethan owns all 60 homes, who actually has the power to approve this resolution? Daniel looked at me. I said nothing. He simply reached for the last document in the folder. And when he placed it on the table, Victoria finally understood why I had never needed to argue with her. The last document Daniel placed on the table was the one Victoria never expected to see. It was the complete ownership summary for all 60 properties, verified through county records and matched against the deeds we had collected. Daniel pointed to the final page. This is the ownership structure the association should have verified before issuing those notices. Victoria stared at the document. That does not give him control over the HOA. Daniel nodded. Not by itself. But it changes who the association is dealing with, and it raises serious questions about how the association calculated its assessments, voting information, and enforcement actions. Nobody spoke. Then one resident asked, So what happens now? I answered before Daniel could. First, nobody gets punished for something they did not know. Second, the records need to be corrected. Third, the association needs an independent review of the fees and decisions connected to these properties. Victoria looked at me with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. You could have told us you owned all these homes. I looked at the 60 folders on the table. You could have asked? That sentence changed the mood in the room. This was no longer about whether I had refused to follow a rule. It was about how quickly the HOA had assumed authority without verifying the most basic information. Daniel then presented the financial records. Several administrative charges appeared on properties I owned, and some notices had been sent to tenants instead of the legal owner. The board members began comparing the records with their own files. One of them admitted that the internal database had not been updated in years. Another said she had never seen the county ownership records. Victoria tried to defend the process, but each answer created another question. Then Daniel presented the original enforcement proposal. Victoria had supported expanding enforcement against what the document called non-compliant investor holdings. Her name was beside the motion. The room became quiet again. I did not accuse her of anything beyond what the documents established. I simply said, "That is why I asked for records instead of arguments." The emergency resolution was eventually withdrawn for review. The board agreed to pause additional enforcement actions connected to the disputed properties while the records were independently examined. The financial records were sent for an outside review, and the county ownership information was used to correct the association database. The police officers who had been called earlier were not needed to settle the dispute. The documents had done that themselves. Victoria did not get the outcome she had expected, but neither did I seek revenge against her. I wanted the rules applied correctly, the records kept accurately, and the residents treated fairly. A week later, Daniel called me with the preliminary findings. The ownership records were confirmed. The 60 homes were mine. Several HOA charges were being reviewed, and the association had begun correcting its records. I asked him one question. "What about Victoria?" He paused. "That depends on what the independent review finds." I hung up and looked out across the neighborhood. 60 homes. 60 separate stories. And one lesson I would never forget. Victoria had called the police because she believed I was a homeowner refusing to obey her authority. She had never checked who owned the homes she was trying to control. By the time she found out, the entire balance of the situation had changed. I never needed to take power from her. I only needed the records to show where the power actually came from.